Hello and welcome to this new video. In the previous video, we implemented the system for creating a dedicated session. And we also checked that the client can find it. Today, we want to continue our work on the dedicated server, to allow clients to join a dedicated session and then connect to the dedicated server to play the dedicated match. To start, go to the DS_session item widget. We want to implement the join logic of a dedicated session. The process of joining a dedicated server is different than joining a lobby session, because in the case of a lobby session, we have done a client travel following the session join, while in the case of a dedicated server, we will use another process to join the server following the session join. So as we already did for the join of lobby sessions, we must go through the player controller to join a dedicated session. To do this, go to the master controller interface to add a new function which is used to join a dedicated session, but before adding it, I want to rename the join session function so that it is join player hosted session. This allows me to identify the role of each join function. Duplicate the function and rename it join dedicated server session. Now go to your master player controller to implement this new function, which will be called when the Join Dedicated Session button is clicked. Return to the widget to call this new function when the button is clicked. I want to correct the parameter name of these two functions in the interface, then I want to fix the change that will be applied on the call of these functions. If you already have the correct parameter name, then it is not worth following me. To start the join process, the first thing to do is to get the server host and port from the session settings. As a reminder, the node join OSS session does not return the correct port in the case of a dedicated session. We must verify that the session has the host and port keys before proceeding with the join process. Call the easy OSS node, join OSS session. Then give it the session name and ID, thus specifying the session type, dedicated. Display an error message to the client if the join fails. If the join is complete, we will not make a client travel as we did for the lobby sessions. On the other hand, we need to update the current session of the client in his game instance. So copy these two nodes. If the join is complete, the client is not yet connected to the dedicated server at that time, but he is part of the dedicated session. What we want to do then is to call the easy OSS node, browse to dedicated server, which allows the client to connect to the dedicated server once the join is complete. If the browse is successful, we will update the current session and then call the event dispatcher. Otherwise, we will not let the client joining the session, so we will destroy the session. Remember that a destroy session on the client side does not destroy the session in the OSS backend, but it just does an unjoin process. So copy these nodes from the join player hosted match implementation. Now we need to pass the host and port to the browse node. Normally that's all. I'll collapse the implementation into a macro to make things cleaner. You can also do the same for the join player hosted match implementation. The collapse to macro didn't work because the call to the event dispatcher can't be moved into the macro. So I want to leave it outside the macro, and I'm going to return a boolean from the macro that tells us if the join process has passed or not. Connect the output pin of the macro. Then add a boolean type output. To pass the correct value to this boolean, I will define a local boolean, which will be true if the process completes successfully, and false otherwise. Update the value of this local variable according to the state of the join process. You can now call the event dispatcher if the macro output is true. Now go back to the game mode of World 2. What we will do is update the number of players in the session when a client joins or leaves the dedicated server. So, do an update session to update the value of the number players key as we did for the lobby sessions. So go to the game mode of the lobby to copy the nodes that we need to update the session. In World 2 game mode, add a new macro which is used to update the dedicated session. Copy these nodes from the game mode lobby and then paste them into the new World 2 game mode macro. Connect the current session name and check the box should refresh online data. Finally, connect the new session settings to the macro input. Connect the output node, then add a boolean that tells us whether the process was executed successfully or not. We must call this macro when a player joins or leaves the server. So in the events on post login and on post logout. What we need to update is the value of the number player's key. I will not modify the other configurations. Remember that existing key value pairs are not deleted in case of update. On the other hand, if an existing key is updated, then its value will therefore be updated by override. Make a map to update the value of existing key number players. If you now launch a test, so a dedicated server and 2 clients, you will therefore see the dedicated session from each instance of the clients. As you see, the join process was executed well on player 1 side. You also see that the dedicated server displayed in the log that a client joined the server. And also Easy OSS informs you that the session update was executed well. Player 2 can therefore see that the session has 1 player now. I draw your attention to one thing: if you click in the dedicated server window, its execution is paused, so you must click on Enter for it to resume execution. If you search for the session in the dev portal, you will see that the session has 0 players, while player 1 is connected. This is the difference between lobby sessions and dedicated sessions. In fact, a lobby session automatically registers players when joining. On the other hand, for a dedicated session, you must register the player in the session once connected. What we want to do is call the node register player in OSS session in the event on post login, then call the node unregister player from OSS session on post logout. Remember that we did this process in case of lobby session, when it was not required, but we did it for a special case of lobby session, so that each lobby member can check if a player is in the session or not from his cache. In the case of a dedicated server, we will do the register and unregister processes only on the server side. I do not need to update the cache of each client in the case of a dedicated server as I did for the lobby members. But anyway, you can do it if you want. Before starting the registration process, I want to organize the implementation of update session. Because it is the same implementation to be executed on post logout, so I want to move this implementation into a custom event that will be called from the on post login and the on post logout. So add a custom event, then move the update session implementation into it. Now call the event in on post login and logout following the update of the number of players variable. Now I need to register the player once logged in. Call the Easy OSS node register player in OSS session. Because this task must take the player ID as a parameter, we must therefore wait until the player controller is ready and therefore the player cards variable is updated. So we must move this task when the event on player controller ready is triggered. Select these nodes, then collapse them to macro. We must first check that the session is valid. It is not very important in the case of a dedicated server because a server does not remain for life if the session has not been created. Finally, it remains good practice. What we need to do now is to pass to this macro the connected player controller reference. Like that, we will get its player card directly in the macro implementation. Open the macro, then add a controller type input, and delete the player ID input, so we will have this information from the player card. We have to call this macro once the player controller is ready. I leave it here for now. Duplicate this macro to implement the player unregistering process. What we need to change is just the task, so we need to replace the task register player with unregister player. We must move the registering macro into the event when the player controller is ready. Call the unregister macro in the event on post logout. This macro must be called before updating the player card's variable. I made a mistake in these two macro. I have to call the getPlayerCard function of the master player controller interface and not the game instance interface. Since I have the player cards in the game mode, I want to get the player card of the connected controller directly from the variable. It is more optimized because we do not make a call via the network to the client's player controller. I want to do the same for the unregister macro. Be careful, in this case the call to this macro must be before updating the player card's variable on post logout. Make sure the session name is connected. I forgot to do it for the unregister process. Now launch a test, so a dedicated server and 2 clients. There, I have 2 dedicated sessions because I did a test earlier and I'm waiting for the EOS backend to delete the old session. In this case, I want to check the session ID carefully before joining it. And there you have it. When player 1 joined the session, he is therefore connected to the dedicated server. We can clearly see in the logs that the player was registered in the session and that the session was updated with the correct number of players. If you go back to your dev portal, you should see that the session now has a player. This means that the register process on the server side worked well. And voila! Everything works fine also when player 2 joins the session. Test the unregistration process by closing a player instance. And there you have it. The server has successfully unregistered the player. As well as the session has been updated, and the dev portal displays the correct number of players. That's all for this video. See you in the next one.